Hello and welcome to the Pulpit Fiction Podcast, the lectionary podcast for preachers, seekers, and Bible geeks. This is episode 679 for Sunday, June 28th, 2026, proper 8, ordinary time 13, the fifth Sunday after Pentecost of year A. Today our gospel reading is Matthew 10, verses 40 through 42, a really short passage about receiving the disciples. Then the first reading of the lectionary is Genesis 22, verses 1 through 14, the binding of Isaac. We won't have a segment on this one, but we do have lots of notes on Romans chapter 6, verses 12 through 23, and you can go back to pulpitfiction.com and listen to past conversations and lots of voices in the wilderness and all this kind of stuff on that text as well. I am Rob McCoy, United Methodist pastor here in Rock Island, Illinois, and I'm joined as always by my good friend and co-host from the shining shores of Crystal Lake, UCC pastor Eric Fissler. How you doing, Eric?
I'm doing well. You know, it's a beautiful day. We're doing a double episode today, so we're recording this early. Rob, you're going to be at camp next week, and it's summer. Things like this happen. So we are recording on the 11th of June, so if something huge has happened and we have not talked about it, that's because we're recording this very early, so bear with us in that. No, things are good. I think I'd mentioned, I don't know if I had on the show, that we had, and by we, I mean my colleague, Reverend Emily Davis and I, when the United States went to war with Iran, we started this Wednesday night contemplative prayer service. And sometimes, you know, you do things like too much and to be honest, not that many people show up. Sometimes we'll get 7 or 8 people. Sometimes last night we just got 1 person. But it's an interesting piece, Rob, and just a shout out for contemplative services, that it's one of the things that I do that, you know, sometimes when we as ministers, we organize and have services and people don't come, or a Bible study or event, and you just think, oh, why did I put this effort into it? There's so many times, like last night, when I didn't know if anyone was going to be there, and I thought, that's fine. I just need this space for me. And if other people can be here, it's great. But just to create some moments of just silence and reflection and prayer, it's been a really cool experience. So we've just kind of, I mean, let me be clear. I wish we weren't at war and it wasn't necessary, but it is. And it's helping me get through the weeks and the news and everything else.
Yeah, I feel like those are those kinds of things that I don't always want to do, but I'm never disappointed that I did.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Like there's moments of like, oh God, do I have to do this again? Like we have an online prayer group every Wednesday. And there are some weeks I'm like, it's right in the middle of the day. I'd rather be doing something else. It's going to chop, you know, but after, you know, when I get there and I get done with it, I'm never like, oh, that was a waste of time. Yeah. Like, it's always like, I'm so glad we did that. And there is something to be said of setting aside that moment where you're going to do it, like, regardless. And part of it's the accountability of, as the leader, is there's other people that are counting on you. I can't, you know, I mean, and I can cancel it, and right. I have. But you can't just cancel it because people are depending on that. And it's never, that's definitely one of those moments where it's not about counting the numbers. It's, you know, not that ministry should ever just be about counting the numbers, but it's, you know, can be a powerful thing with 1 or 2 or with 10 or 20. It doesn't really, that's not what's the measure of a worthy endeavor.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We talked a lot last week about Pride and Pride Sunday and things like that. So I just want to give a quick shout out at the top of the show here for sanctifiedart.org. Sanctifiedart.org has some amazing resources for Pride Sunday as part of their Special Sundays bundle that also includes Earth Day, Pentecost, Pride Sunday, World Communion Sunday, and I believe All Saints Sunday in there as well. So you can go check that out. Use Pulpit Fiction at checkout to save 15%. But if you've got a big Pride Sunday, I know this is for like generally Pride Sunday. It's the closest, and actually I think it is the day of the Stonewall riot, if I remember correctly. Isn't that June 28th, if I remember correctly?
I feel like you're right, yeah.
And so so a powerful thing. And also, just real quick, apologies for last episode, because Rob, we had a great conversation last episode, and we talked about Hagar, and we talked about some of the liberation, counter-slavery narratives, and some of the great stuff that Dr. Gaffney had given us. And we never mentioned that it's also Juneteenth was last week, and we just totally missed that opportunity. So apologies for that. I'm sure that so many of you heard it and were shouting into your, podcast things, but that's good because then you guys realized it and put it all into your sermon and preaching and teaching and all that. But we'll endeavor to do better in the future.
Yeah, that's a bad miss right there. Yeah, and you're right. June 28th is indeed the day the Stonewall riots began, June 28th, 1969.
Yeah. Well, all right, now let's turn to our good news for the week.
Very few comparatively know what is the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Good news, everyone!
All right. Well, the good news kind of rounds out this passage that we've been in, Rob, for June, for almost all of June here, this missionary discourse. It's Matthew 10. It's very short compared to the last couple of weeks. Matthew 10, 40 through 42. Those who are receiving you are also receiving me, and those who receive me are receiving the one who sent me. Those who receive a prophet as a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. Those who receive a righteous person as a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. I assure you that everybody who gives even a cup of cold water to these little ones because they are my disciples will certainly be rewarded.
Okay,
That's it.
That's it. Yeah, that feels like, yeah. All right. This was a tough one because it just seems so simple, and it's the context is so important, right? This is the end of chapter 10. More importantly than chapter 10, it's this missionary discourse that began with Jesus and the 12, naming the 12 disciples, commissioning the 12, talking about responding to harassment. Last week we talked about the divisions that are coming. We didn't talk much about the whole idea of whom to fear and what to fear, and the violence that might happen to you isn't as important as the deeper, the deeper rewards and punishment that could come. Trouble in the family, and now this is the capstone on it, and it's a sort of, okay, this is what you're doing. It's going to be hard. There's going to be, you might get harassed. It's worth it. And those who receive you will be receiving me. And there's an element here of, is it really that's it? Like there is that moment of being like, okay, but to a certain extent, yeah. It's that simple, but that's also incredibly complex, right? Like receiving your prophets are like receiving Jesus. I mean, it's a foreshadow almost of the last discourse of the sheep and the goats, right? Separating on the right and the left. Like this is like a mini version of saying, like, you're going on my behalf, you're representing me, and in that text, and that context is, when you see someone suffering, you're seeing me. When you help the least of these, you're helping me. And it's just this, almost, I think of the John sort of abiding in me. You're living in me. You're doing what I'm supposed to be doing. When you are received, I am received. When you help others, you're helping me. It's this deep intimacy of an identification of Christ with, in this aspect, with those who are doing Christ's work. We are, and it reminds me again of the prayer of Saint Teresa, right? Christ has no hands, but your hands. Christ has no feet, but your feet. This is, and that's my paraphrase. I don't know if that's exactly it, but I feel like that's the connection here is, Jesus basically saying, I can't do this all by myself. You need to go and do the work now. And when you do, you're doing so in such a way that I am with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we hear that piece, right? That these are representatives that are embodying this. And there's an interesting piece that here's the odd piece, Rob, is that this sounds like a warning to other people, to the people who are not involved in all of this, right? It seems like a warning to those who are going to be receiving them, but it's not. This is also just to the disciples. This is continuing him to talk to the disciples. And in that, I think that remember, this also follows directly after last week. And I think that there's a word of warning here in a variety of way. I did just a little bit of just Googling and looking into this idea of 41, and specifically with those who receive a prophet as a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. Those who receive a righteous person as a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. Like, what does that mean? And some people say, well, they're about the same thing. They're the same thing. Why would he say it? And how are prophets, those who receive a prophet as a prophet? Well, how were the prophets received? They were not received well.
Yeah.
They weren't received well by anybody. Nobody really likes to receive a prophet, right? Prophets are not winning popularity contests. They're like, to some extent, there's almost like a prophetic. I was just talking with my boys about this, the prophetic notion of the court jester. We were talking about jesters and things like that, in that jesters had the prophetic ability to use comedy to speak truth to the power of the king. Right? I mean, that this was part of what they were supposed to do, in the same way that in the ancient days, right? The only reason we have prophets is to speak power to oppressive, abusive, and unfaithful systems, whether that's exemplified by the king or by the people. And this is what we see in all the prophets. But either way, to receive a prophet as a prophet is typically to reject that prophet, to not want to hear it. And also what happened to those prophets, and we hear this referred to also in the gospel, which is what happens to those prophets. They killed those prophets also, and they persecuted those prophets. So there's an interesting piece that said that there's almost listen, we just talked about how you're going to be persecuted by your family, by your religious community, by other people who are going to reject you and persecute you because I'm sending you out as sheep amidst the wolves. Listen, those who dismiss you as they dismiss the prophets, reject you as they reject the prophets, beat you as they beat and abuse the prophets, they're going to receive a prophet's reward, right? Those things are going to come back to them. And there are those kind of, it's almost a karmic sort of thing, that those things are going to come back to them. But really, Rob, I think it's an idea of, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to call vengeance upon them. You don't have to do that. That's going to be taken care of. However, those who receive a righteous person as a righteous person will receive the righteous person's reward. What does it mean to receive somebody as a righteous person? It means to give the hungry food, to give a cup of cold water, to embrace this radical hospitality that we heard a couple weeks ago in Genesis 18, as it was paired with this idea that they are being sent out to be receivers of this amazing hospitality, even as they are bearers of the good news, that there's this mutuality of mission. And those, right, who give a cup of cold water, who receive them as those who are righteous. And we remember that what is righteousness? Righteousness is exactly what you were saying, Rob, which is embodying and carrying out the way of Jesus Christ for Christians and Christ followers, or the way of God as we see in the Old Testament, right? The righteous are those who are embodying the way of Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible, the way of Christ in the New Testament.
Yeah. Yeah. And, drawing from Russell Rathbun, who wrote in The Hardest Question with the blog that we've talked about, there's an element here of, sometimes we get caught up in the big movements of the kingdom of God, right? The advocacy, the marches, the great shows of courage and, speaking truth to power, and these great moments. Sometimes what we're called to is just offering someone water, right?
Yeah.
Like the deeply personal, basic things matter too. And I think about the, receiving somebody as a prophet or a righteous person. I think this could, it's also about receiving people who aren't righteous.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking about the story you told last week about, at your Pride event, when there were people sort of infiltrating. And every Pride event I've ever been to, there is someone there, right, with a megaphone and a sign, like just trying to infiltrate, trying to do something. I'm not even sure what their goal is. And what does it mean to just offer them water?
Mhm.
Not to take the bait, not to enter into the angry argument, or to try to even try to convince them otherwise, because I think that sometimes we want to debate and enter into the arguments and enter into the fray, and you see ourselves as sort of I'm going to go in there and defeat this fearmonger or whatever it might be. But what I've never argued anybody into changing their mind. I don't know if I've ever done that, but I have lived with somebody and while they changed their mind, as we offered them water and prayer and grace and relationship, that has affected people's lives over the long run. And I have seen people change their minds and change their ways and repent in very powerful ways. But it wasn't through the sword or the proclamation or the march. And I'm not saying those things aren't important. But I think sometimes we can lose sight of the very personal, intimate moments that can help as well.
So it seems a little odd, Rob. So what you're suggesting is that we should reach out and care for those who persecute us and revile us and spit on us and reject us.
Yeah. And it's easier. And I also take very, very aware that it's easier for me to do that
100%
in the body that I have and the privilege that I have than somebody else. And that's partly why it's so important to do it when I can. But.
Well, and we're on the, I believe it's the 11th anniversary. Yeah, the 11th, just last week would have been the week before this, the 17th is the 11th anniversary of the horrific shooting at Mother Emanuel. Right, where you saw the unbelievable radical hospitality that led to the murder of 9 parishioners, right, that came into the Bible study, and how they did exactly what you said, Rob, right? They welcomed somebody in, even though everything in that person's presentation said that they were only there to embody hate and violence, which is eventually what happened. And yet that unimaginable and immense courage and compassion to live out their faith and do that is I think, a challenge, a prophetic challenge to all of us in the way in which they embodied the gospel in that moment. And also, I think for many of us is a word of caution and warning, where we hear that and we say, oh my gosh, but this is what hospitality can lead into. We've talked last week, Rob, in the last couple of weeks about the danger that faces the disciples. But what we have not talked about is the danger that is inherent in hospitality by welcoming somebody into your home, by welcoming somebody in, that is dangerous. And it is more dangerous the farther somebody is from the normative center of culture. And I think that's what you're referring to, right? So for you and me, is it dangerous? A little bit, but it's not that dangerous because of who we look and where we are in the midst of our broken society. And so to find ways that we can continue to encourage people and create those safe places for those for whom the risk is immensely greater than either of us could probably conceive of. And so understanding that this is not and I think especially in preaching this in the midst of pride in the wake of Juneteenth, and also of the 11th anniversary of the Mother Emanuel shooting, and so many other things that are happening in our world, whether it's the war with Iran, whether it's the continued persecution of immigrants and in the United States, to understand and acknowledge our privilege, and also find ways to encourage that and understand and recognize the immense risk that hospitality bears out.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also a historical context of this, of, Douglas Hare points some of this out in his interpretation, that part of what this is happening too is that, Jesus is telling his disciples to be different from others. Like the wandering prophet was sort of like a job people had. You could go around and bring good news or bring messages and gain followers. And this was done in a way that, almost like vaudeville, like traveling acts, right? And that was a profession. But the ones that doing it for Jesus were supposed to be different. And, accepting a glass of water, which is you could argue is the bare minimum of hospitality. Right. They're not expecting extravagance, right? This isn't, again, this is anti-prosperity gospel. What you should be getting, the bare minimum is enough. And this is, you're not going around trying to get rich on this message, which we hear, in Acts, when somebody wants to buy the Holy Spirit from Peter and John, or Peter, I think it's Peter and John, when they're like, hey, this trick you did is great. Let me pay you money. You can show me how to do it.
So Simon the magician. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And I think there's an element of that as well, that Jesus is reminding them that you're doing this not to get rich, not to gain notoriety. You are little ones, not children, but you are little. You're not trying to gain clout or be influencers. You're trying to win hearts and minds. And that's very different. And I think about that in the context of today, obviously by using those two words, right, of Christian influencers, and are you trying to gain followers, or are you trying to spread the gospel?
Yeah.
And, here we are on a podcast, right? We want followers. We ask for subscribers all the time, right? But why, so you could argue that I'm as guilty of it as anyone, but I think there's an element here. It's being warned against that sort of, Christian ambition is a tricky thing.
Yeah.
Christian celebrity is a particularly tricky thing.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that's the world we live in. I think this speaks to that as well. It's a reminder, the glass of water, that's what you're doing it for.
Yeah.
And I think of how rewarded we are, when we go to something and, somebody recognizes our voice and the words of thanks. And it is very cool. But that is the reward. We're not getting rich doing this by any stretch, right? I think we treat ourselves to one dinner a year, but
and a couple private jets, the usual, Rob.
Well, yeah. I mean, come on. How are we supposed to get to? Yeah. Anyway, absolutely.
Yeah. No, I think that's an important piece, right? Because I do think that there is a temptation to celebrity. And by the way, when we talk about, I think about Christian celebrity too, is it's a broad range. I don't think that a lot of people are trying to be Creflo Dollar and get a $95 million private jet that I was making a joke about. But we all have celebrities in our own fields, right? We're like, we want to be as cool as and amazing as Tracy Blackman and things like that. But there are a lot of those folks that are true. And I think, Tracy Blackman is a good example of that, who is so influential in the Black Lives Matter movement, has been really influential in social justice and racial justice in the United Church of Christ, and an incredible prophetic voice for the church. Like, it's amazing how many of those people, and she's the first one. And we talked with her. We had talked about her when we interviewed. I think it was After Faith After Ferguson. I'm blanking. Leah Gunning.
I can't remember her
Francis.
There you go.
And she had talked about the fact that most of the authentic, quote unquote, celebrity pastors had no desire for that. They were just in the place at the time, and they lived out the gospel, and then things happened. So I think that that's a powerful piece, as opposed to kind of curating that, which is tricky. Rob, I want to go back to an interesting piece too, which is, and we have this in the show notes, kind of some of the connection about those receiving, prophets, and the poor widow who received Elijah as the prophet. And Elijah does the same thing, asks the widow for some water, and she gives it to him, and things like that. The difference is this: yes, she does those things, but it was also a question of the fact that this was a widow who was completely alone, and this random strange man comes up to her. We've talked before about how was she honored, and was her son eventually raised from the dead because of her extravagant hospitality, or did she do so because she felt like she had no choice?
Mm.
And that was an issue of power. And we had a commenter who kind of wrote us and said, hey, think about that. And so I do think that, be careful if some of you were hearing it's like, but what about the woman who welcomed Elijah? I think that's a little bit more of a complex narrative. I also, in addition to that too, this idea of, can it be that simple? This simplicity of simply the power of just offering someone a glass of water. And I was reminded that this last week, and the most basic human need, even before food, even before shelter, like we need water, right, to survive. And I was thinking about this last week, and as you said, I had this run-in at Pride with the group that was there. And as I was trying to follow the guidance of the leaders of the Pride Festival, which is always important if you're being involved in Pride, talk to the organization leaders, let them know how you want to react. And they had asked not to engage. So I was pulling back one of our amazing parishioners who had been engaging and saying, you know what, we're not going to engage. We're pulling back. They tried to engage with me. And I said, we're not going to have this. I said, we can have this card later if you really want to have a conversation, but this is not the time and place. And then at the end, I reached out my hand and I said, you know, I hope you reach out. We can have a conversation later. And they would refuse to touch me.
Hmm.
And they go, I don't touch homosexuals. And it was such a stark, fascinating thing. First of all, you know, just assumptions that they know nothing about, number one, but also the dehumanizing aspect of that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so there's the reason that I was thinking about that now is, also offering someone a cold cup of water reminds me back of like when whites and people of color couldn't drink at the same drinking fountains. Right. And there was this, the power of Fred Rogers, you know, sharing the swimming pool with the black police officer that was there. You know, these they're humanizing. They're just really basic humanizing aspects that allow us to see one another. And so, you know, it's not, we often think like how complex and all the things that we're asked to do. And sometimes it's not that complex. Sometimes it's simply offering a glass of water and acknowledging someone's mutual humanity and needs in the midst.
Uh-huh.
There's a lot more in the show notes, friends. You can find all of that over at pulpitfiction.com.
Previously on the Bible.
I smell Heaven's Bakery cooking up something good for you, sister.
Well, Heaven's Bakery is cooking up Genesis 22, 1 through 14. Yeah, this is a big one, important one for a lot of folks. After these events, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. Abraham answered, I'm here. God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him up as an entirely burnt offering there on one of the mountains that I will show you. Abraham got up early in the morning, harnessed his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, together with his son Isaac. He split the wood for the entirely burnt offering, set out, and went to the place God had described to him. On the 3rd day, Abraham took up and saw the place at the distance. Abraham said to his servant, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will walk up there, worship, and then come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the entirely burned offering and laid it on his son Isaac. He took the fire and the knife in his hand, and the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father, Abraham, my father? Abraham said, I'm here, my son. Isaac said, here is the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the entirely burned offering? Abraham said, the lamb for the entirely burned offering? God will see to it, my son. The 2 of them walked on together. They arrived at the place God had described to him. Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He tied up his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. But the Lord's messenger called out to Abraham from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Abraham said, I'm here. The messenger said, don't stretch out your hand against this young man and don't do anything to him. I now know that you revere God and don't hold back your son, your only son, from me. Abraham looked up and saw a single ram caught by its horns in the dense underbrush. Abraham went over, took the ram, and offered it as an entirely burned offering instead of his son. Abraham named the place the Lord sees. That is the reason people today say, on this mountain the Lord is seen.
Yeah, wow. There's a lot that's in here, and there's a lot within. So there's the immediate context, and there's a broader context that we had kind of talked about last week as well, Rob, which is it's interesting that we end with this idea on, hey, in this place the Lord sees, because as we talked about last week, this is a name that we have heard before. El Roi, which means the name in the Bible, which means the God sees, the God who sees, or the God who sees me. And that is the name that Hagar gives to God. When she runs away and flees the horrific abuse that she is receiving from Sarah and Abraham and their household, and she flees in Genesis 16. And so there's an interesting piece that in both of these we have this call back to this idea of a God who sees. And similarly, last week, with the rejection of Ishmael and the resilience of Hagar, depending on how we view that, there's an interesting parallel there in that last week we had a God who hears, literally God heard Ishmael crying. Here, God sees what Abraham is about to do to his son. And so there's a fascinating kind of combination that we have there. And then the final one too, of course, is this idea of the hand at the last moment, right? So right when Ishmael is about to die, we have the messenger saying, take him by the hand, right? And to save him. And here we have, don't take him by the hand. Don't stretch out your hand. We have the opposite of that, both saving actions, one a do and one to stop doing. And so there's just such an interesting parallel between what we have last week in the story of Hagar and Ishmael, and then what we have this week with the story of Abram and Isaac. And I think really explains, I think, for both of these passages, as in all of Scripture, it helps illuminate how we see God in these moments, right? This is a God who hears. This is a God who sees. This is a God who saves. These are the pieces that we have. Now, I think, Robin, this one, it's particularly seems hard because it's like, wait a second. He sees, but he sees Abraham doing the thing that God asked him to do. And I think we get so caught up in so many things. Fear and Trembling by Soren Kierkegaard, Highway 61 by Bob Dylan, The Parable of the Old Man and the Young coming out of World War I from Wilfred Owen, the great poem there. Right, we captures the imagination, and really I think that this is a broader message than the nitty-gritty of Abraham and Isaac and the horror of what's happening in this passage.
Yeah, there's this passage is so problematic in so many different ways, and I think we try to redeem it sometimes. Sometimes I wonder if we try too hard to redeem it and just say, instead of just saying this is horrible.
Yeah.
This is can you just say this is a text of terror and this is something that we're moving away from? This idea that God would ask this of Abraham. But here's my reading that I think is helpful, especially on the Sunday of Pride. I think this is a Pride reading in a lot of ways, and let me explain why. Because Abraham, I think, in a very real way, was doing exactly what cultural religious people did. He was doing something that was. And I'm not, a historian, so maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, human sacrifice for gods was something that was part of cultural norm to a certain extent. And I think he was doing exactly what he thought a faithful person should do. And it wasn't remarkable. He was sacrificing his son for his God. And God stopped it. And I think about how many folks sacrifice their children. They wouldn't necessarily put it in those terms, but they are doing exactly what they think a faithful parent should do, is to sacrifice their God-given, the beauty of their queer child, and instead see them as broken and needing to be sacrificed for some reason. And they're willing to literally bind who they are, bind who they were created to be. And they're willing to destroy that child because it is what they think is a faithful thing to do. And God, I think, is stopping them. I mean, they don't always hear it. Unfortunately, there's too many parents that do not hear Abraham, right? That do not hear God calling them out to stop them. And I think about our role as you and I in particular, as all affirming clergy and people of faith, that I think part of our job is giving people is claiming calling their name and saying, stop doing this, stop sacrificing your children for what you think is what God wants you to do, because it's not. And this, as horrifying as this story is, I think it is, you have to put it in the historical context of a time when human sacrifice was something people did. And now Yahweh is not that kind of God. This is a declaration that who God is not the God that would call you to sacrifice your own child. And that's problematic in some of the moments of the reading and some of the interpretations of it later in scripture. But I think there's an element here of God showing Abraham that who God is different from the cultural widespread understanding of what gods do. Our God is different.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful piece. And I think that it's interesting. It feels to me like a very human passage. And all of scripture is written by humans, but to some extent it reminds me of like Joshua, right? And the conquest narratives of Joshua, in which God commands the Israelite people to commit horrific mass genocide against the Canaanites and those in the land. Unwarranted, unprovoked mass genocide, right? Not that genocide is ever warranted or ever justifiable. There are horrific things that people have done and continue to do in the name of God. And I think that this is a text of terror in the same way that last week was too, right? I mean, we can say last week was also a text of terror and equally as horrifying, equally as condoned by God, right? In order to protect Ishmael, in order to protect Abraham, right? God says, Abraham, don't worry about it. He'll be fine. Just abandon Hagar and abandon Ishmael. Also horrifying. I think that the opportunity, which you brought out so beautifully, Rob, is there are horrifying things in this world. And we don't redeem this text to say like, oh, well, it's okay because Abraham was being tested and look how faithful he was and things like that. Instead, we focus on the fact of just as God saved Ishmael, God saves Isaac. And stop. Can we stop sacrificing our children? And I think that this could actually work in a much broader context, Rob, too, which is very specifically, and I love the connections that you make very intentionally to the persecution of LGBTQ children, which, and by children, I mean, doesn't matter how old they are, but just the rejection and persecution by their families, thinking that they're doing something healthy, but also the way in which we stand by and sacrifice other children, and we think that that's a somehow a faithful thing to do, and so we sacrifice immigrant children who are separated from their families and put in concentration camps here in the United States. We sacrifice Palestinian children who are being murdered by settlers, and the United States continues to funnel unimaginable amount of money through various organizations to do those settlements. We continue to sacrifice Iranian children who have been brutally murdered and killed in this war, beginning with the accidental bombing, but a bombing nonetheless, of an Iranian school. And we sacrifice those children for the sake of something. I'm not even sure why we're at war, and neither does the administration seem to have a clue of why we're at war. But we find ways to sacrifice those things, and we do so too often couched in Christian nationalism or other things, the way in which we support new school voucher programs, and people think they're doing that in order to provide for religious education, when what we're doing is we're sacrificing children who are part of the public school system. There's so many different levels that we can talk about the ways in which, yes, we reject child sacrifice, which is really what this is about, and God says stop it. But in the same way, that there are so many different layers and ways in which we continue to sacrifice children. We continue to cut them off, and either our own children or other children, and we justify it in religious terms. We dehumanize, and we find ways to say, well, it's not that, it's something different. There's something bigger at hand here. And that's the piece where, I think that the focus then comes back to God said, stop it. Don't. And that's who this God is, which is coming back to what you said. Yeah. But I do think that there's a piece where you just have to name both last week and this week just the awfulness of this passage. And it's also a question too. We make a little tongue-in-cheek joke about this, but one of the most beloved hymns in almost every church I've been to is "Here I Am, Lord. Is it I, Lord? I've heard you calling in the night." Right? I mean, that's the refrain in this passage. Here I am. Here I am. Here I am. And so, and I think it would be a powerful sermon to ask, where are you? Like, are you holding the knife over the child? Are you trying to save that child? Like, here I am. Are you with a God who saves? Are you with a God who continually over and over provides a way for life and reconciliation and possibility and abundance and has an ever expansive view of love and grace and acceptance? Or a God that we use to justify our most horrific actions?
Oh. Yeah, and I throw out there too, and I don't feel like I should check this one more time, but I know I've shared this before. This, I'm pretty sure, is the last time Abraham and God speak. I think there's an element here that Abraham failed the test. I mean, because he didn't know who God, he didn't know who God was. Abraham was testing God to a certain extent. He didn't understand that God would never do this. And Abraham and God never speak again, not in the same sort of direct conversations that they've had all the way up until this point. There's an end of innocence in this story, both I think with Abraham and I think obviously with Isaac. It's a turning point, I think, in the story.
Yeah, that's really it. You're right. You're absolutely right. I was just double checking it, and yeah, they don't speak again. This is it. That's an interesting. There's got to be. I don't know this for sure, but Rob, there has to be a midrash about that. I mean, I feel like that's something where the Jewish scholars have got to have done. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, it's one of the great gifts of Judaism is the midrash, but there's got to be a piece of that. So, we have not done that work for you, beloved, but look into it. That's a fascinating piece, which is it's right. The gospel is written by the winners. For them, not always, or the scripture, right, is written by the winners too often in many circumstances. Now, I think one of the beautiful things about scripture is like we do have Abraham, who's a very complex person in many different ways, and I think that's beautiful, that complexity. But it's interesting here, this idea of you've passed the test, and the question is, but did he actually pass the test, right? Or did he absolutely fail this test? And yeah. And how?
So I haven't had a chance. Obviously, I haven't had a chance to review this. I just found an article in reformjudaism.org about some of the midrash, reading between the lines with this story. So I'm just gonna throw it in the show notes. I haven't had a chance to review it. I literally just found it as we were talking. I'm not sure where to put it.
Just throw it in the thoughts and questions, but we'll acknowledge. So it'll be at the end in thoughts and questions, but do your own review as you're looking at it, but it might be just hopefully opens up some complexity. And we'll put that in the show notes under something that says, God doesn't talk like the last time God and Abraham talk. It's a complex passage. It never gets easier. Doesn't matter. And it is one that captures people's imagination. Now, for me, Rob, I think I've shared this in the podcast before. At First Congregational Church of Crystal Lake, we have multiple stained windows, but only 2 of them depict scenes, biblical scenes, which drives me nuts because the whole point of a stained glass window, in my opinion, is to show the biblical scenes. And the only 2, Rob, that we have is this passage. They are both of this passage. Which kind of isn't great, but it's just kind of an interesting piece. So anyway, friends, go and check out the link that Rob put in the notes and so many other things. You can find all of that over at pulpitfiction.com. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Pulpit Fiction Podcast. We are so excited that you joined us. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome to the Pulpit Fiction Show. We'd love to hear from you. There are a lot of different things you can do. But first of all, if you haven't headed over to our webpage, pulpitfiction.com, do that. That's where you can find all of our exegetical notes, links to the different resources that we have mentioned, and you can comment right there on the show. You can also sign up for our weekly newsletter where we will send you links to all of the different exegetical passages and to that website, and we'll email it right to your inbox each and every week. You can also find us on Instagram and Facebook at Pulpit Fiction. Find us on X at Pulpit F Podcast. You can email us directly, show@pulpitfiction.us, and support this show by going to pulpitfiction.com/support.
Well, you can watch the show on YouTube, watch us live, and interact and talk to one another. We're at youtube.com/@pulpitfiction. We love it if you would watch on that channel. And if you do, like and subscribe and just help us build that up a little bit. You can watch us also live on Facebook Live, where I did look, we have about twice as many people watching on Facebook Live as we do on YouTube. But that's not surprising considering how many Facebook followers. We've been on Facebook for 13 years. We've been on YouTube for 6 months, so not even. But anyway, thank you for all those who watch us live. Thank you also to Scott Fletcher for the voice bumpers, Nikolai Heidelis for the transition music, and Brian O'Dean for our closing song. Please have a blessed week.
Hate to say it's time to go, but it happens every time, you know. So now you're free to go about your day. We've heard the word in voice and song. We've wondered and we've laughed along. So go and preach the good news on your way. This is the Pulpit Fiction Podcast for preachers and seekers and Bible geeks. This is the Pulpit Fiction Podcast. We'll see you back next week.